I'm Peter Hale, talking to legendary coach Ron Barrassi, who's coached 500 plus games at various clubs. And Ron, your first chance at coaching was at Carlton. You must have great memories there.
Oh, it was a great club, Carlton. I was lucky enough to be in on the ground floor when they began rebuilding the place back in the middle 60s, and they've been a very strong club ever since, and most of that's been due to a lot of effort by a lot of people, of course. I think the father of the modern Carlton is a fellow called George Harris. He was the president, incoming president when I arrived there as coach, and he's done a lot for the Carlton Football Club. I hope they appreciate it.
Absolutely, I've got no doubt about that. But Ron, it's as a player and coach, it's 42 years, I believe, and 10 premierships. And I guess, has the most valuable lesson been in Sydney?
The most valuable lesson? Oh, I don't know about that.
In terms of, well, I guess I should put it another way and say the most difficult one, perhaps.
Well, it's difficult in it's you're in an environment that's not at all, but it's not as comfortable. It's not the usual football environment which I've been used to prior to coming to Sydney. But it's a tremendous challenge, and I think one day they'll win through for Sydney to become a very respected sporting institution in this town.
The SCG has put you up as co-tenants.
Yes, well, there's a lot of people who feel that we should have moved out to the west, where more population is and all of that, and that may well be so. You can never prove these things one way or t'other, but the Sydney Career Ground Trust have been very generous to the Swans in recent years. I think they feel also that the Swans are going to be around for a long time, and with greater support from the AFL, they feel that there's a future for the Sydney Football Club, and I couldn't agree more.
These days in coaching, you can't rush the building time. And
yes, it's a slowly type thing, because as you say, you can't do it quickly these days, particularly with the draft. I know the Rugby League Players Association had the draft thrown out, or the draft mechanism thrown out, and I think they'll live to regret that myself. I think it's a short-term view, and I think the draft makes it possible for all to survive, and in the end become very, very even. And I think there's nothing better for the fans than to have a game that they're going to go to that they're not sure whether they're going to win or lose, and they're in anticipation. I think it's a much better sporting environment to have that set up. So the other side of the coin is, of course, you can't by hook or by crook or by having zillionaires on your board or whatever quickly buy a parcel of players and get up the ladder in a hurry. You just can't do that these days, and that's a bit sad in one sense, because that was very exciting times for whoever was involved in doing that sort of thing. But no, the Sydney Swans are slowly building, and I think it'll pay off in the long run.
Looking back, when you built teams at Carlton and North Melbourne, were they fairly quick in comparison?
Well, I haven't been here as long as I was there. But
of course, yeah.
No, they were quick. I think at Carlton, when I went there, they were the lowest I'd ever been, and it just shows what a strong club they were. But they'd fallen on parlous time, so to speak. I think they were 10th in a competition of 12. That was the lowest I'd ever been. They'd never received a wooden spoon in their lives. They were, I think, over 100 years old at that stage. And we're in a premiership in 1968, so that's sort of 3 years. At North Melbourne, it also took 3 years, but I don't think the same thing could be done today. In fact, I'm sure of it.
Ron, the 4 premierships at Carlton and Norths, do you want to go that far with Sydney, being that it could take 2 or 3 years?
If they did it in 2 or 3 years, that'd be very quick, I would think.
I'm Peter Hale, talking to Ron Barrassi. Talking to Ron Barrassi, I'm Peter Hale, and Ron, Who actually convinced you to take on the Sydney Swans?
Oh, a fellow called Ron Joseph, who unfortunately resigned from the club just recently, and it was a real blow to all concerned. But he tried about 18 months ago. 18 months before that, and I was sort of very, very lukewarm, and the Swans were lukewarm at the time. Nothing came of it. But 18 months later, which was over 2 years ago now, he came round and he said, well, the F's about to hit the F at the Sydney Swans, and you've got to help them out. And it's not an easy job to get a coach of some experience in the middle of a season. This is what a lot of people forget. You just go and pluck a coach off the trees. They might have done it in my case, coming out of retirement. But that's why, and it was really my desire for a Sydney team to be very powerful, holding its head high in the Aussie rules clubs in the country, because I think it's very essential for our sport.
1993, he took over from Gary Buckenara, and I feel a bit sorry for him, because personally I feel he was in the wrong club with a lack of coaching experience at the wrong time.
Yes, he was.
And now he's at Subiaco, and they're on top of the ladder at this moment.
Well, he could become a very good coach, and he's a fine man and all that. But you're right. It was a very tough call to bring him here, completely inexperienced in a football situation like this. And the amount of support I've had off the field, backup support, was probably 2 or 3 times what he gained. And it was nobody's fault. It was just the way it was. And I really feel sorry for Gary.
Ron, you've been hailed as one of the game's great innovators, masterminding Carlton's 1970 premiership, for example, where I believe in the second half you included a heck of a lot more handball. But Ron, on that subject, you have business interests, including a hotel, and you do motivational talks. Are the motivational talks football orientated, or you generalise more?
Oh no, generalise. In fact, don't mention football that much, to be quite frank, because I think motivation's an all-round thing. It's not just to do with football; it's to do with life, and to do with anything that needs a bit of get up and go and a bit of energy put into it. You need to be a bit of a self-starter in your life, I think. And I talk in a general sense. Often in question time, the football subject will be raised, and we take analogies from football and from sport. But in the main, no, it's just on my beliefs in that direction.
In my situation, I went through martial arts to the point where I got a black belt, and then I just dropped out because I felt I'd reached my goal. But the fact is, in martial arts, you can still be learning after 30 years.
Well, I think, you've got to examine whether you want to go further. It's all very well for people to say, well, this is a good thing, but unless you believe that it would be a good thing to go on and worthwhile for you to go on, well, you won't do it, and nor should you, by the way. It's like me, a couple of times in my football career to date, I've given up coaching because I'd lost the real urgency and the desire to do it. So I got out of it. No one can do very, very well at something that they're not wrapped in. And the converse applies. If you don't like what you're doing, you won't do it very well. And if the urge comes back, we'll do it. You're not harming anybody by doing it or not doing it. It's just purely an individual thing. I reckon it sounds as though you're on the right tram, mate.
In the modern game, you still use quite a few old principles, even though it's changed quite a bit?
Oh, yes. I think the principles of the game are built on getting the ball first and doing the best thing at that moment with it. That'll never change. It doesn't matter how long we'll play the game. But I think the biggest difference is a lot of things are being taught now to every player, and it's a team-wide thrust to get players to be doing what in the old days used to be called a good footy sense stuff. So it was only the players who had a natural sense for the game, a natural nous, a natural feel, the sort of things they would do naturally. They're trying to make sure that all the players do it these days. They use different terminology, but basically a great player from the past would be doing this sort of thing without even knowing that he was doing it, you know. Whereas now, they all know what they're doing. If I might have explained myself too well there, but...
no, that's very good, Ron.
Well, you know, basically, there's a few new things, like the use of the interchange bench. Well, very hard in the old days, you didn't have interchange. But the game has become very, very tactical, and particularly for the side that's under the hammer, the side that's losing on the day, because I'll give you an example. I mean, you might see them make a change which puts a tall of theirs on a shorter person of yours, so you are forced to move your short player off the field or elsewhere on the field and put a tall player there to equalise their tall player. But if you're in front, you might say, and if that happened, you might say, well, you know, we're in front and we've got control of the ball a lot better, so when we kick it towards that pair of players, we'll make sure we don't kick it high so that the opposition's height will not be a factor. In fact, they'll have to change theirs. They'll change theirs to have a short, because we're taking advantage of that player's greater pace on the ground and agility on the ground, etc., etc. So there's a lot of that goes on these days, and a lot of set plays, particularly from the fullback. And Robert Wall started that about 15 years ago with his little huddle. There's a lot of things have changed. Coaching aids, like with the use of the video, have changed that a lot. I mean, although I was using it back in 1985 at Melbourne, this new invention, and I was told I was over-coaching at that time, but now, of course, everyone's into giving as much information to players about their opponents and about the game as they can. Yeah, all the clubs have got this thing that's been on the market now for some years, but it's what happens, you look at a video of the game afterwards, and you key in with the aid of a computer, you key in all the events that you want. If you want to record, look at later, have the player look at later, whatever they may be. There might be tackles, marks, kicks, left hand, right hand, left foot, right foot, shots for goal, centre bounces, throw-ins, or anything you see in the game that you want to have recorded and be able to pick out, you put into the system. So that will take about 6 or 8 hours. And at the end of that, you can then, by putting a computer in line with a VCR, you can ask those two machines to spit out number 11's tackles, or number 10 player marks or mark attempts, and it'll search through, record, search through to the next one, next tackle, record, search through to the next tackle, so on. So you get to the player at the end. You've got a tape of all his tackles, and you've been on his back about his tackles have been too wild. He's been giving away free kicks, or they haven't been strong enough, or whatever. You know, so it's a very good teaching mechanism.
I'm Peter Hale talking to Ron Barrassi. I'm Peter Hale talking to coaching legend Ron Barrassi. And Ron, when you're coaching, no doubt you get a lot of assistance.
Oh yes, in fact, you know, the game's gotten so changed now and so professional that, I mean, for a long while now, coaches have needed assistance. That's with the TS and the CE. Even on the game day, you just can't see all of the game yourself, because our game is so vast and the length of action is so big. You've got to have a guy, you know, behind the play, on the play, and in front of the play virtually. And we have 2 men on the what we call the board during the game. Just take note of where all our players are and where their players are, who they're on, who they're opposing. So when they make a change, it's noted on the board with your magnetic names. Otherwise, you wouldn't know. Well, you'd see what was happening, but you wouldn't know why it was happening. You wouldn't know that player Smith has now moved somewhere else, and he should be taken by player Jones instead of player Brown. You know what I mean?
As a player, your highlight, I guess, was being vice captain in 1957 grand final.
Well, that was a very big highlight. I mean, it's like a coach. Well, for me, it was. in that the highlight was always the premiership. And I was fortunate enough to be with the Melbourne Football Club, who were doing the same sorts of things as St George Rugby League Club. They went on to 11. We had 6 in a similar amount of time. Not quite as successful, but it was a hell of a time to be there. And I choose that match as my sort of playing highlight, because it was the first time I'd been in a leadership role, not the leadership role. That came later, but and I played a blinder, which is very pleasing. And it's pleasing, of course, when you win. And so I had the 3 things going on that day, and I was 21, so it was, for a young man to experience that was a top pleasure, I can tell you.
Norm Smith must have been a tremendous influence on you.
Yes, he was. He was my only coach. He coached me for 12 years. He was a teammate of my father's. I lived with him for 4 years. I worked with his brother, who's also an absolutely marvellous coach, Len Smith. I've worked with him for 8 years. And I've had a very fortunate background, and I say fortunate without any sense of humility, because it's just a straight-out fact. I was just plain lucky to have come along into those circumstances. And that's the sort of luck of the draw that, you can't buy. Money can't buy that. But he was a marvellous man and a marvellous coach, and he will go down. The Smith brothers, I think, will go down as the largest forces in modern football, in my opinion. Particularly Len. I think he's perhaps the father of modern football. And I'm often asked who was the better coach. One had 6 premierships, Norm Smith. 6 as a coach and 4 as a player. Len Smith had none. So to even talk about Len Smith being in the same ballpark as his brothers must mean that Len Smith had something, because usually people only take those as premierships. But Len was the first man to put in Aussie rules, to put down a set of rules as to how the game should be played in the playing sense, and he did it so clearly and simply. It became a coaching must to use his ideas and use this method of making the game much simple to follow or to play. And he was a marvellous coach, Len Smith.
I'm Peter Hale talking to Ron Barrassi. Talking to key motivational speaker and top coach, of course, Ron Barrassi. I'm Peter Hale. Ron, you've been involved with several clubs. What do you regard as your favourite?
It'll get down to Melbourne. I had 12 years there as a player. My father played there. He was a premiership player before the war. I had 5 years there coaching. So my roots are so strong there, but I've got a tremendous amount of affection for North Melbourne and Carlton. I really have. So I'm just lucky to be able to consider that I've got three football fathering clubs, if you want to call it that sort of thing. I'm just lucky there.
Absolutely. Back to the current day, Ron, with the New South Wales country development, there's a fair bit of work being done there, isn't there?
Yes, there is. I'm sure there could be more done. I guess that's the same in any situation. You could always do more, but there are limitations on all this, because it costs money. If you want people to do these jobs properly and do them 40 and 60 hours a week, well, you've got to pay money, and once you start talking money, there are limits. This is where I think the success of the Sydney Swans is going to be very important, because it will put the Aussie rules into the information networks, into the print media and the radio and the television, and that's a help to anyone who's talking Aussie rules. And we're trying wherever possible to bring this the local flavour into effect. I mean, it would be silly to take that to the stage where you only had locals, because it would be against the sort of the theme of the national competition number 1 and 2. Just at this stage in our sports development, it wouldn't be a good enough team. So it would be defeating the image we want. But we've got about 40%, and the higher we can get that, the better.
Strong areas, of course, are Wagga, the Riverina, Canberra, down around there. But I guess any individual player, there's a player that wants to play for Sydney one day, areas don't come into it really. It's a personal motivation, isn't it?
Yes, there is, but I think the draft system means you can be drafted from anywhere in Australia. There are a few exceptions to that at this stage. In the end, it might be just a purely open draft. But somewhere along the line, I'd like to see a regional aspect come into it, because there's nothing like barracking for the local boy that you see down the milk bar or at the hotel or at the bank or whatever. I think that gives an extra flavour myself, and if they could combine the main thrust of the draft, which is to have an even competition, combine that in some way with a district scheme. The trouble is to make all districts equal, the number of potential footballers they can produce. That's always been a problem. It might be a mixture of the two. I don't know. That's in the future. It's a long way off. But I think the local stuff is really, really good.
Employment problems and opportunities are hard to come by, but I believe you've worked your training around that to help these guys.
Well, we try wherever possible, because we're alert to the fact that it is difficult to combine work and football these days. The demands of both are pretty high, so we try and fit in wherever possible. I think it's most important that footballers have an eye to the future. When they're not footballers, they'll need a career. So if they've got a profession or a trade behind them, they're going to be so much better off. And I just like to pass on to anyone listening, don't take your eye off the ball to that extent that you forget about your career. I mean, it's still possible to combine both. It's very difficult, it's very time consuming, and you certainly won't have a normal social life for a few years, but it's worthwhile making the effort, I reckon.
Well, I'm very interested in your opinion on the Super League.
Yeah, well, I presume you mean a Super League which has been initiated and or funded or both by an outside source.
That's correct, yes.
Yeah, I think we should have a Super League, so-called, in other words, a reduced number of teams, certainly in Melbourne, without anyone's influence whatsoever except ours. And I think we're going to rue the day if that doesn't occur reasonably quickly onto the rugby league scene. Well, I think rugby league will come out of it quite well. It might be messy for a couple of years, a couple of months, I don't know. I've got no doubt that Rupert Murdoch doesn't want to run rugby. He doesn't. He just wants the television rights for his television empire that he's set up around the globe. That's what he wants. It's interesting that when people talk about television, they do forget one thing, and I'm not condoning News Limited's approach at all. I'm neutral on that. But I'm just saying, a lot of people have, for a long while now, said, well, why are we taking notice of what television wants? Well, it's a pretty, it's a wrong way of looking at it. We've always catered to the customer. The customer in the past has only been at the ground. He's put his bum on the seat at the venue, and we've catered to him. We've made him possible for him to be a member and get a cheaper entry price. We've put pie stalls there for him, and we've put seats, we've put roofs over the seats, we've called them stadiums, and we make fixtures and all sorts of things for the person who's paying the bill. And that's quite right, and we accept that. Well, the guy who's got his bum on a seat that's not at the venue, I think he's a customer too. He's a supporter too. He's an interested person also. And with the national competition, and in the case of international competition, you can't get everyone at the venue anyway. So I don't see why a person not at the venue, but seeing and barracking and supporting and paying money, maybe not as much, should have some influence. And therefore, his or her desires should be catered to in some way. I'm not saying slavishly or stupidly, but they should be brought into the equation, I think. And just because they now are, more obviously, people, I think, unthinkingly think it's wrong.
Just one final question. I was reading Polly Farmer's biography, and he mentioned during that at the time he took the job at North Melbourne, he actually had the first option of taking the job. I'm not asking you if that's correct or not, but would you say if Polly had taken that job, would have had similar success to yourself?
Oh, that'd be impossible to tell, but I mean, the North Melbourne club was so much on the go. Their administration had just become so expert, and they led the way in many fields there. I would doubt if they wouldn't have become strong, whether they would have had the same success or they could have had more. We'll never know that one.
I'm Peter Hale, speaking to Ron Barrassi.